Hello everyone, welcome back. We're going to continue with a series of videos looking at the Miko buffs in various team archetypes, and this time we're going to be looking at Pyro carries, specifically Pyro carries in OverVape teams and I guess as well Overload teams, but we're definitely going to be focusing a lot more on those OverVape teams. In this video, I'm going to be mostly thinking about a few Pyro carries, in particular Mavuika, the Pyro Archon, who I'd naturally be playing with someone like Shillinen in these teams, Arlecchino, and of course Dehya, who I'd be naturally playing with someone like Farina in these teams. The buffs that Miko got are pretty much going to affect the Pyro characters in a similar capacity, but what's interesting is of course the team construction considerations that we can make with Miko instead of some other characters. Now, the buffs that I'm looking at are just simply going to be the turrets lasting 24 seconds, C2 giving Miko in the on-fielder plus 200 EM, and of course C4 giving Miko plus 8 energy whenever her turrets hit enemies every 5 seconds, and of course the 100 ult %. Before we continue, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel because as always, your support can help combat the YouTube algorithm. I think this topic is going to be rather straightforward, and that might be reflected by how much shorter this video is. The turrets lasting 24 seconds continues to be a major part of rotation buffs for when you actually want to play her. I feel like this is more so a Mavuika buff than the others, because Arlecchino doesn't have a set amount of on-field time. You can of course swap back to Miko early. This does kind of end up being a DPS loss though, so back in the old days with the only 14-second turret duration, this kind of was a problem I guess, but at least you don't lose something more important like Arlecchino's Pyro infusion for example. Dehya, on the other hand, depending on your investment and of course the team, tends to run into ER problems, so having that downtime can result in you having an opportunity to refresh Miko's turrets. Obviously, nowadays, you don't have to worry about any of that, again, because of the 24-second long turret duration. Miko's C4, on the other hand, making her ult more accessible and stronger, just simply means we don't have to run double Electro or the likes of Fischl or A to get her ult back on a somewhat regular basis. You do still need some ER, I think it's around about 130 give or take, don't quote me on that though. If you're playing with Fav Chevy, at that point you don't need to funnel that energy from the Favs proc, but the Favs proc will still be something that actually helps in getting your ult back. Speaking of Favs, when Shiznaya drops, we're going to be getting a new Battle Pass Spear option that could be another way to battery the team, so that's just something you might want to keep your eyes on. One of the things that kind of gives this buff a little bit though is that Miko's ult is still going to have a 22-second cooldown, which makes it a little awkward to use. Unless you're playing the Mavuika team, in which case you actually have C2 Shillinen as a potential option if you actually went that far to get her, and at that point it does make Miko's ult so unimaginably, hilariously, eye-wateringly trivial to achieve that I go so far as to say EEEQ, it's just part of the rotation. As far as I can tell, using her ult versus not is pretty much a DPS neutral, or at least within the margin of error, so if you're looking to actually enjoy watching her stare into your soul like I do, well, her ult is just something that you can use in the Mavuika team with C4+. And bear in mind, this is with my testing of my C6 Miko, where her skill is also significantly doing more damage, so if you've actually stopped at C4, I get the feeling using her ult is actually a DPS buff. Let me know in the comments if your testing has resulted in a different result. By using her ult, I ended up with pretty much the same amount of damage, just actually shifted from Mavuika to Miko and vice versa, hence it being a DPS neutral experience. So naturally, if you put more investment in your Mavuika, for example, let's say more than my R1, then in all likelihood Miko's ult is going to end up being a DPS loss. The big buff for Miko that of course changes everything continues to be Miko's C2, giving both herself and the on-fielder plus 200 EM. Now in this team, since we're not playing Dendro memes, that plus 200 EM is only going to mean a plus 30 turret % buff, and that's about it. Instead, let's focus on what this means for the Pyro on-fielder in a Vape team. There has been a rule of thumb when it comes to EM thresholds for various reactions, in particular Vape and Melt. The idea is that once you reach a certain point in your character's EM, additional EM starts to lose value and you'd rather look for sources of other stats like attack. That threshold is, as far as I understand, usually around 200, although I have heard some people mention 300 EM as being the most final threshold to aim for. This is important because Miko is giving the on-fielder plus 200 EM, so her buff alone usually fulfills the threshold of EM that you would actually need on your characters before they start heavily considering other stats. Now in a previous video looking at different builds for Mavuika Vape, I discovered that among the artifacts that I have on hand, I seem to do a bit more damage running Attack Pyro EM. instead of an EM saddle hat. This is due to the nature of something like 1,000 Blazing Suns, as well as the mass amount of attack percent stats that I am already getting on the team via the likes of C2 Shilinen and of course Iansan. The lack of any external EM buffs means running those EM pieces, even instead of crit pieces, seems to result in a bit more DPS for me. With the introduction of Yae Miko on the team, this is of course no longer the case. I get a small DPS boost by running attack Pyro crit instead of attack Pyro EM. That being said though, I should point out that by some sheer Christmas miracle, and I really don't know how this happened, I somehow managed to get a slight DPS increase running an EM Pyro crit, and that's with slightly overcapped crit rate as well. So that just says to me that at the end of the day, there's no hard and fast rules per se. We have a simulacrum, so always test your builds out in that and see which one actually works best for you. Now, like we've been doing in all these videos, let's have a look at the difference in Mavuika's OverVape DPS between pre and post buff Yae Miko. Yeah, bear with me chat, bear with me. Okay, let's do that. Ooh, really need those turrets to be lasting longer. I think my setup was taking too long too. Don't forget to swap back to Farina, Kate. Oh, there's also going to be the C4 buff for Miko. Which means I'll be able to get her ult back even more reliably. Let's go! Won't heal this round. Okay, come on. Maybe I should have healed this rotation. $144, $644. As opposed to what did I get with attack Pyro EM? 140. Yeah. Looking forward to seeing what the remarkable improvement of this team is. Yeah, we'll just have to find out. Huh. That's interesting. Huh. Okay, that's really interesting. I wasn't expecting that actually. Huh. Sorry, I should be overcapping on EM, like to the point where it becomes a thingamajig. Should be becoming a thingamajig. Oh no, Miko. Oh, sorry, no, Mavuika's actually doing very similar damage. Farina is doing more damage. Miko's actually doing more damage. Okay, that's within the margin of error then. Huh. Okay. I also want to point out a couple of observations that I've made in preparation for this video. In the Mavuika team, Shilinen seems to usually get us an Electro Scroll reaction, so this is actually a version of the team where her running scroll is almost hilariously pointless. Obviously, if your Miko isn't as invested in mine, this might still be somewhat hilariously pointless, but my Miko is contributing around a third of the team's DPS, so I'd say it's actually an alright compromise. Pyro Scroll, as far as I can tell, is practically impossible to achieve on this team. C6R1 Miko seems to result in a slightly stronger Mavuika Vape team than C6 Symphonist Iansan. So naturally, if you're even one constellation off, just stick with Iansan. Either way, they're both still seemingly weaker than the Hexavape Mavuika team that I've recommended. That's the one that isn't hella cringe to play. It's also the one that actually can get a Pyro Scroll, which is of course going to change everything. So yeah, I suppose if you're into that, or I guess if you're into the super duper hella cringe Hexavape Mavuika team, good luck, Godspeed. I can't really help you in that regard. I don't know how to play that one myself. Meanwhile, C6 Miko and Farina seem to be slightly stronger than running R2 Bineffa, with the major advantage being the lack of shield that has allowed Dehya to much more easily use the full extent of her kit. I'm talking about things like Bacon of the Red Seas and of course the Vorukasha set. They require Dehya to get hit, or at the very least someone to get hit inside Dehya's field in order for her to start taking damage, which then of course opens up a whole bunch of damage percent and I think even attack. Just useful things for Dehya to do more damage. Remember, unless your Bineffa somehow has 3k attack, which might actually be quite achievable if you have someone like Chevy on the team, she's actively giving less EM than Miko's C2. In these teams, Colombina tends to be doing significantly more DPS than Farina. Farina is still pulling her weight by providing that team-wide damage percent buff, so there is that, and that's why Dehya and Miko are actually doing more damage, but Colombina being such a big DPS in and of herself does seem to actually sort of drag that advantage back to being pretty much the same kind of damage for both of these teams. I somehow seem to be getting a couple more vapes out of Dehya with the Bineffa team though, so I guess in the grand scheme of things, I'd probably stick with Bineffa and run Serpent Spine and EOSF over Sig and Vorukashas. If you really want the most meta version of an OverVape team, it actually still remains to be absolute meta slop with Mavuika and Bineffa. In the meantime, the Miko build that you want to use is either Golden Troop if you hate using her ult, or of course 2-piece. I wouldn't go for Gilded Dreams since in this team everyone else is an Electro, meaning that you're just going to get EM on Miko whenever she triggers a reaction. And that's EM on top of the 2-piece EM that only translates to some more turret percent, which is nice, but it's not super duper necessary, especially if you already have her C2 and she's getting another 200 EM by default. Ideally, you'd stick with, of course, Attack Electro Crit, but I'm lazy and I did all my testing on Attack Crit, and that's also all my B-roll. Look, I think it's actually perfectly valid, but obviously if you want a bit more damage, you would use an Electro Cup. This is definitely, again, one of those moments where I wouldn't recommend EM pieces, again, due to the nature of the team. I think that'll do it for this video. Again, we're looking at a much more straightforward team archetype that doesn't have those wacky mechanics like Dendro teams or even the Raiden Inquisition. I purposefully left out talking about Overload teams all that much because at the end of the day, it's really just the same idea as OverVape, but you lose Miko's C2 because Miko's C2 doesn't really mean anything unless you're going up against a target with an underlying Hydra Aura, in which case you're back to playing OverVape. We have a couple of local legends in Tulpa, but they're not super common, so this is all just really something to keep in the back of your mind should that need arise. At the very least, though, I have found that Miko's buffs end up being a major boon to, of course, my enjoyment of Yae Miko in these teams, especially with the far accessible ult. We have one more team archetype to talk about before I turn my attention to Sandy Sandrone, and of course the various stellar memes that we can play with these characters. So let me know what you think about all this in the comments below. How do you feel about OverVape teams with the new buffed Yae Miko? Are you actually participating in any of that kind of content? Let me know in the comments. Of course, there are also bosses now like the Watcher that actually have a potential sort of boon to playing an OverVape team as opposed to a straight Vaporized team. So we have that. Prism Slime is another new boss that potentially might give you a reason to play OverVape as opposed to just straight Vape. So yeah, you know, we have things to play around with, so I feel like this team is definitely something worth considering if you want. Look, again, as always, it's just another team that you can play with Miko, okay? So, you know, have fun. Anyway, hope you guys enjoy this. If you like this video, hit that like button, subscribe for more Genshin Impact action, and until next time, I'll see you guys later. Thanks for watching. Bye!